So now let's go back in. Just so everyone know you're being recorded, because that's what the privacy policy says. You have to know. All right. So, intro to Gatsby and GraphQL, and a few lessons learned thrown in the mix as well. We had this talk, I think, a little, maybe 8 or 9 months ago, I think it was. Leighton gave a talk on TypeScript, and I gave this one. So those two talks kind of together in the same session. So that's why the slides aren't that many slides, because we were doing that. But I figure we can do it, and we can ask questions, and we can fill in the time that way. So has anyone heard of Gatsby before? No? Okay. GraphQL?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Cool. So let's do this. I think this is relevant. We do a little bit of history about how we got here, or how, at least how I got here. You know, so I started programming in 1995, way back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. No GUIs at the time. You know, it was just mostly logic and data processing. First website was in 1999. It was basically built completely with JavaScript. JavaScript did the rendering. JavaScript pulled the data. Then there was classic ASP. It was like, oh, this is interesting and different. That was my first little taste of Microsoft stuff. It was very much that type of shop. Then web forms with .NET, a little bit of Ajax sprinkled in there for some server side, but it was all built server side, and then the HTML was kind of passed down. And you kind of did the inner HTML type thing, fill the data in. Then we went Web API and AngularJS, and that was like really nice for a little while. And React with Web API and GraphQL, and now you start to see the GraphQL kind of creeping in some of the topics that we're talking about. So that was interesting. First time I started using React, I wanted to throw up in my mouth every time I saw it. And I realized it was not really React, it was the way the React was being used on the project that I was on. So things I thought were like, this is how you do it, or actually, no, this is not how you do it, this is how they did it. So lessons learned there. So latest project was Gatsby project with GraphQL and a CMS, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about a little bit today. But I kind of wanted to show the progression of how we got here, because we'll talk a little bit about these things as we go along and compare them to what we have currently. So what are static sites? So Gatsby is a static site generator. So what are static sites? Anyone want to take a guess at what static sites are?
It's like dumb HTML.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah. So I think it's useful, and I think I put it this way, it's useful to see what they're not, right? So they're not dynamic sites. So think of anything that you generate on the server, like you're generating your HTML and how it lays out and all that stuff on the server, and then you're passing that down to the client. So those are dynamic pages, dynamic sites. So they're not that. So static sites are basically files and static files that are pre-built and served without any change from the server, right? So we have a lot of static files in your dynamically built site. So your JavaScript files are static, your image files, that sort of thing, your CSS, that's all static. All those are static files. Have HTML that you're not server, like changing on the server, then those are also considered static files as well. So what are the pros and cons of this? Or let's just say, what are the pros of it? Speed. If you have a straight HTML CSS page, it's going to load a lot faster than probably your average server render page. Simplicity of hosting, so you can host a static site anywhere from GitHub or Azure function, Lambda function, or you can host it on a CDN, you can host it on a server, you can host it out of like a blob storage, that sort of thing. Any of those things, you can host it. Security is oddly one too as well, and security is the reason why we chose the stack that we did. There was the project that I'm going to show you later was started off by one of our former interns, and he was going to use some other stuff, and I asked him, well, if the content is pretty stable, then why don't we just use a static site there where we don't have a server running, we don't have that attack vector, we're just hosting things. So that security is another reason for static sites. Developer experience is also another one. So after you get the initial setup going, it's pretty seamless to run. So that's, and we'll talk a little bit about the developer experience as we go along. So that's static sites. So how is this different from HTML pages? So the maintenance. So you can basically say, well, I can just generate a bunch of HTML pages and that'll be my static site, which is fine as long as you don't have a ton of pages. You start having a ton of pages, then now imagine you're trying to change the header. You gotta go through and change the header on every single page. You're trying to change the font color. You're trying to do something like that. All those pages would need to be changed, updated. So the maintenance is the reason for using a static site generator for that. Yeah, so that's basically that. So how's it different from a SPA? You know, single page applications are all the rage, right? So with the SPA, you end up having that, well, I think it's part of there. So your HTML is already populated. So, you know, when you have a SPA, you end up getting that flash of white before that starts to render, you know, as your JavaScript's being downloaded, and then it goes off and does the HTML, the API call to get the data to then render the page. So you don't have all that waiting when you have a static site generator, because all the content is already built into the HTML and it just comes down. HTML is streamed in, whereas JavaScript has to be fully loaded before you can start executing it. So you're going to get faster load times with a static site generator. Static site, yeah, so no flasher content. You get better SEO if you have a public-facing site as well. How is it different then from server rendered SPAs? Because you can server render your SPA ahead of time. Actually, these are supposed to be questions. So how do you guys think it's different than a server rendered SPA? Yeah, I don't remember too. So pages are not rendered at request time. So let's say you have a server rendered SPA. It's very similar to your server rendered page. So only thing that happens, let's say, for example, you might have a Node.js application on your server side that basically does the requesting and acting like a client, gathering all that stuff, all the API calls that go back and forth, but it's quicker because they're on the same server, right? And then passing that HTML down, but still, imagine there's still some back and forth that happens there. So your end result is a little bit slower, still faster than the regular SPA, but a little slower than if it was just already generated ahead of time. And you don't have to have that node service running on the server. Again, your overall architecture is a little bit less complex because you don't have to have that additional thing running on your server. So let's say you had a Ruby server, you know, your code is in Ruby, and you have to have now a node process also running. So you got a Ruby and Node, or Rails in Node, and or Django and Node, depending on what your actual server's running under. It's faster, that we mentioned that before. Right. So there are a number of static site generators. Gatsby is one of them, but there are a lot of them out there. So the list is huge. Like every language has static site generators in it. Almost every framework, no, not saying that. Lots of frameworks have also static sites that are generators that are built around that framework as well. So here's just a few of them. Jekyll is a pretty popular one. That one's based in Ruby. That was initially what the developer that had this project that we're going to show later, he built it originally in Jekyll for a couple of reasons, and we'll talk about why we changed that out. Next is another one. Next is built on Ruby, but it kind of does a number of things. Not Ruby, I'm sorry, JavaScript and React. But it kind of does a number of things. It does a server render component if you want to do that. But it also can build static sites as well. So that's an interesting one. Gatsby is the one we're going to talk about today. That's also built on React and JavaScript. Hugo is built on, I want to say Golang. I can't remember for sure, but I think it's Golang. And there's a number of other ones. So, but what is Gatsby, since we're going to be talking about Gatsby today? So the website basically says Gatsby is a free and open source framework based on React that helps developers build blazing fast websites and apps, which is interesting. So if I say static sites, are you thinking normally apps? Probably not. You're probably thinking content sites, that sort of thing. But Gatsby is an app platform as well. And we'll talk about why that is as we go into it a little bit. Built on React, enables multiple data sources. This is another key thing as well. And I'm not sure if I had this in the slides yet or not, so we'll just talk about it here and we'll skip it if it comes up again later. But let's say, for example, you have your average application or whatever, maybe it's backed by a CMS or by a database. You tend to only have one data source. But with Gatsby, you can have multiple data sources. In the project we're going to look at, there's at least 2 different data sources that we have. And you can have as many as you want. So if you have data coming from multiple places, Gatsby is a nice way of putting a wrapper over all of that and bringing it into the same location. Really, really useful. Really, really nice to have. Again, it generates static content. Here's another point too. It hydrates a spa after the initial load. So let's say you were going from page to page, you're not getting a full page refresh. It's now a spa. So you're getting the benefits of a static site and the benefits of a spa without the downsides of either, right? Because you get the fast initial load, you get great SEO. You don't have the downsides of that on the spa side, but you get those nice user interactions of a spa. So you don't have the downsides of going page to page and refreshing each time. Yeah.
Christine had a question. How is it static if it is going to a server or CMS?
So the great question, Christine. So the content is built ahead of time. All your JavaScript, your HTML, all that stuff is going to be built ahead of time, and then it's going to be served up from the server. The server is not going to change that as you're going along. Or as a request comes in, it's not figuring out what to render each time. Can you read the other part of the question? I forgot part of it.
How is it static if it is going to a server or database?
Okay. So the database portion of it. So that's all that data is going to be pulled at build time, and not at runtime. And we'll show an example of that. And so although you can have different data sets, you can pull those in at build time so that the content that goes out is static. Now that being said, you can still at runtime hit a server and pull in data as you would in any SPA application, right? So you're not limited to having everything happen at build time. If you want to have dynamic things, let's say for example you're doing a shopping site, and so you have different things that you can purchase. So all the content can be basically static, right? Like your options that you have, but your inventory is not going to be, that's going to change dynamically. So you can render the page with the static content and then get dynamically the number of inventory that you have hitting an API. So again, benefits of kind of both worlds there. That's a good question. All right, so Gatsby APIs. There are some Gatsby specific things that are different from React or above and beyond React. In general, most of your stuff is going to be React based, but here's a couple examples of APIs. And linked here, they have a number of different API things, but I just pulled a couple of them out that are relevant. So you have a CLI, command line interface that you can use to build and generate your Gatsby site as well as serve it up. So a couple of commands there that you want to know is Gatsby new, that builds a new site. And I'll show this command. Gatsby develop runs the site in development mode. Really useful to have there in development mode. It's going to do a couple of things for you where it's going to have hot reloading. So you can change the code and just look at it, and the updates will show up. So nice for that. Gatsby builds it for production. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference of that in the lessons learned section. Gatsby serve will take your production build and serve it up so that you can see what it looks like as it would be in production being served up. There's also Gatsby info and a couple other ones. If you do Gatsby-H, you'll see a list of commands from the Gatsby CLI. So Gatsby config is a file that's going to be in your project. It's going to be, I think, Gatsby-config, I believe is what it's called. We'll take a look at it later. That's where your configuration is going to happen. So if you have those data sources, that's where they're going to be configured in there. There's also a Gatsby Node API as well. So if I wanted to generate multiple pages, I'm probably going to do that in the Gatsby Node file, where I have basically a node process kind of running at build time, not at runtime, but at build time. So we'll see an example. We'll dive into that a little bit and show some of the things you can do in there. Gatsby themes is pretty awesome. So let's say I wanted to create a shopping site and a blog and some other stuff. Usually when you go out there, you're looking for themes, you might find one or the other, but you don't find a combination of all the things that you want to do for your particular site. You know what I mean? With Gatsby themes, you can take those different individual applications that are packaged and then roll them all together how you want. And as those things are updating, then you can get the updates without breaking your site, which is pretty cool. So you have basically like this underlying pin, and then you can change things on top of that in a different file location. So then when you update the underlying thing, you still have your local changes, and those overlap whatever's in the Gatsby themes area. Pretty freaking cool. Yeah. Yeah, I basically said that. I didn't realize. So Gatsby plugins is another great reason for using Gatsby. Yeah, so one of the things that makes Gatsby so popular is because of the large number of plugins in the ecosystem. The plugins do lots of different things. Like I said, this number is from the last time I did the presentation. It was about 8-9 months ago. I'm guessing that's probably a lot higher now. Couple examples of plugins. So Gatsby source file system. So remember I was talking about using different data sources? You can use your file system as a data source, which is pretty cool. Gatsby image is basically an image processing plugin for you. So let's say, for example, you are on a Retina Mac or you're on a really old flip phone. The images that you serve for both should be different. So this will process all your images and then serve the appropriate image for the device that you're on. So if you're on a low bandwidth device, it'll give you a smaller resolution image. If you're on a high retina device, it'll give you a higher resolution image. It'll also do that thing where it says, okay, you know how sometimes you'll see a page load, and then the image loads later and the whole page refreshes and recycles. It'll give you a low resolution image and then fade the higher resolution image in for you. You don't have to do any of that stuff.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and that's just one of the plugins. Pretty sweet there. So you plug in offline. So anyone heard of service workers? All right, so let's say, for example, you have a website and you want your website or web application to be available to people that are offline. Then you can use a service worker, and basically that service worker intercepts all the web requests, and you can do stuff with that web request. So let's say, for example, you're on a train and you're going through a tunnel. Then that service worker can kick in and you have an offline experience for that user, right? And Gatsby plugin offline will do that for you automatically. You don't have to really do too much there to configure it. So again, just a couple of the plugins that are really pretty cool. Again, CMS plugins. They have plugins for almost all the CMSs that I can think of. So you just put that plugin in, and now you can connect to your CMS of choice and pull data from there. Same thing with databases and so on and so forth. So Contentful is one, WordPress is another one, Drupal is another one. We're using Strapi for ours, and we'll talk about a little bit why. So now the reason for Gatsby and GraphQL kind of being linked together in the same talk is Gatsby uses GraphQL as its data layer. So all those different data sources that we talked about will all get exposed to you in Gatsby via GraphQL. And we'll talk a little bit about what GraphQL is. Anyone heard of GraphQL before? Any thoughts on what it might be? Yeah. So the name's a little confusing, a little bit, but once you understand it, it makes a little bit more sense. So let's talk about what it's not first. GraphQL is not a graph database like Neo4j. Often people get that confused, right?
That was going to be my guess.
Yeah. So again, that's it. The name's a little confusing until you understand what it is. But what is GraphQL? It's a query language for your API. So graph and then query language is where the QL comes from. Graph meaning like graph of an object, but not graph of a like nose and edges sort of thing. So let's just read it. So GraphQL is a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those requests with your existing data. GraphQL provides a complete and understandable description of the data in your API, gives clients the power to ask for exactly what they want and nothing more. It makes it easier to evolve your API over time and enables powerful developer tools. That's a mouthful. Let me break that down. So GraphQL was designed by or created by Facebook. So if you look at Facebook, how many clients Facebook has, they only have one API. And that one GraphQL API satisfies every single client from almost the dawn of time until now. And then later on, they have the one API. So how do they do that? It's because of GraphQL. Well, with GraphQL, if I have an endpoint, or let's take that back. If you had REST and you hit an endpoint, then you have a pre-formulated response to that endpoint, right? So let's say, for example, I hit an endpoint, it's /users, and had first name, last name, social security number, and a bunch of other stuff in there. But what if by my purposes of my client, I didn't need the social nor your location, just need a first name and last name. I would get all that data back regardless if I needed it or not. With GraphQL, as a client, I need the first name and last name, and I need the address, but I don't need anything else. So just give me back the things that I asked for. So that's how you can have multiple clients hitting the same API endpoint and getting different data sets back, specific to what they need for that particular view. The other thing to that is that it's typed as well. So I know first name is going to be a string. I know last name is going to be a string. I know address is going to be a type address. And inside of that, it's going to have a number for the number part and a string for the street name. So I know those types are coming back. I know what's going to be there. And we'll show a little bit more about that. But because of those types being there, you can get really good developer tools where it's like, yeah, you're asking for this thing, but that don't exist. Maybe you meant this, or you're asking for this date. You're asking for this thing back, and it's coming back as a type date, whereas you're trying to treat it like it's a string, that sort of thing. You get these built-in tools that are really cool. It talks about this being a query language for your existing data and your APIs. So I can point this at existing RESTful services and create a GraphQL endpoint on top of that. So let's say, for example, some of my data is coming from a database, then I can pull data from there, but some of my data is coming from a third-party API that I'm hitting as well. I can put GraphQL over top of all of that and mix those data together in a schema and pull out exactly what I need from all those data sources. So again, query language for your API, query language for your data is what this becomes.
I think Azure also, right, using GraphQL.
A lot of people are moving to GraphQL, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but GraphQL, I believe, is going to be the future for a lot of these data sources. It changes the way things are being done. Primarily, I think one of the first people to pick it up, large people to pick it up and make it like their official API was, what do you call that place? GitHub. GitHub has a really big GraphQL API endpoint. They were one of the first big companies to adopt it, but since then, there are a lot of people adopting it, and you'll see why as we go through. So GraphQL is also, it's not a product, it's a spec. So you can have GraphQL implementations in multiple different languages. The de facto is Node.js, but you can, if you're writing in PHP, there's probably a GraphQL.
Christine had a question on the query. She says, does the query end up looking SQL-ish?
No, it doesn't. It looks like JSON, and we'll look at that. It looks like JSON without the data, which is pretty nice because you can hand it off to a business person and they can still build it and use it, which is another benefit of GraphQL. For example, one of the reasons in your project, Eric Flex, you have, let's say, like RAs that are really good at financial data. Mm-hmm. They can't necessarily build their own API endpoints. Mm-hmm. You can hand them a GraphQL client and they can explore the data however they want, mixing, matching, doing all type of stuff. So it's pretty useful to have.
I'm sorry.
Again, it's not a product itself. It's a spec. The reference architecture, or reference implementation, is in Node, but I know I've seen them in Ruby and .NET and various other languages. If there's not one in your language of choice now, there's probably going to be one shortly.
What I meant was like.
So let's go over a little history of how we got here. So RPC and RESTful services. So RPC is remote procedure call. That's basically what we had way back when, right? I call a function on a server and I get the data back. It's useful because it's concise. It's formed given the, I don't know why I even put this. This is basically you hit that endpoint, you know what you're going to get back per endpoint, right? So let's say, for example, I'm loading a page and I need several bits of information on that page. I need the user's picture. I also need a list of places they commented and a list of blog posts that they have, and I want all their comments. I can have one RPC endpoint that gets all that information, so it's concise for the data that I need. And I'll say why I port that up in a minute. So the cons of that is it tends to be tightly coupled to the client and not reusable. So if I had that endpoint, I get all that data back, and I want to go somewhere else and have the same similar data, but not the same, now I have to form a whole another functional RPC endpoint to do that thing. So now let's say I want to change the user's name. Instead of having first name, last name, I want to have name. I gotta go to all these endpoints and fix them all up, and all the clients and fix all the clients up as well. So it's tightly coupled, client and server, not very reusable. So REST was supposed to fix some of that, right? Where it's like, yeah, we don't want to have these things tightly coupled like that. So we're gonna have resources and endpoints and then that sort of thing. So again, creating resources for all your entities. It leverages the HTTP verbs, so you get the get, the post, the put, delete, where the get's going to get your data, post is going to create new data, put is going to modify data, delete ops is going to delete your data. The pros are it's reusable, right? But the cons are you end up getting this overfetching, this N+1 query problem where, let's say, for example, the one I just mentioned where you have the user and you want to get their posts and the comments. Then first I got to get the user, so I can get the ID of the user. Then I got to send that ID of the user to the post area to figure out which post I get. And then I have to also send it to the comments area to get the comments for that user back. So you can imagine you have this N+1 query problem where it's like part of my page is loading and the other parts of my page are still spinning because I need this data to get the other parts of the data. It's reusable, but again, you start ending up with these things. And then generally speaking, what I've seen people end up doing is creating an endpoint that has those things combined together, which now you defeat the whole purpose of REST. You have RPC in a RESTful kind of wrapper, you know what I mean? But for performance reasons, you end up doing these things. So the benefits of GraphQL, again, the client controls what data is provided and what the shape of the data is. You get one endpoint for all your data. So you don't have to figure out what's the REST endpoint for this thing that I'm looking for. Like it's all the same endpoint. You can get many resources in a single request. So you're less likely to have that N+1 query problem, at least on the client side. We'll talk about a little bit more how you resolve that on the server side. Again, and you have a schema, so you can get that type system. We mentioned that before. Powerful tooling, we mentioned that before. So built into a lot of the implementations is a thing called GraphQL, or if it's GraphQL, and it's basically a playground to get to your data. And we'll see some of that examples as well. You can evolve your API over time without versioning it. So who's had to version an API before? Anyone? Yeah?
Like /v.
Ah,
Yeah.
So that's what some people do, like /v1, /v2. So how do you know which, like that gets cumbersome. Another way you can do it is putting it in the headers. Say that version, that version. But with GraphQL, you don't have to do any of that. You can basically say a field is deprecated. You can keep a field around forever and just pass back data that you want to keep for it. You can add new API, new fields onto it without having to again version it. So it makes versioning your APIs a lot easier. All right, so lessons learned, and we're going to jump into a demo after this. And some of this will make more sense as we go through the demo. So this is speaking about Gatsby itself. So development mode versus production builds. When you're in dev mode, you're able to access the browser APIs like you would normally. But you got to remember that all your HTML, all your stuff is supposed to be built on the server and pre-compiled, which sometimes you're in dev mode and you're working, things work fine. But then you go to production, you do a production build, and it's like, no. That's not legitimate. right? For example, let's say, let me go back. You access the window API. That's only available in the browser, right? But then you have it in your code, and it's trying to run that. It's trying to build that ahead of time. And when you do your production build, it's going to fail because like, wait, window doesn't exist because it's building it inside of a node process. So you then have to wrap those things, say, hey, if Windows here, then do this thing, and then that only would happen once it gets down to the client, but it would not happen at the browser time. And there's some workarounds for that, and I'll show you some in the code that we have. But when you're in dev mode, it's kind of cheating a little bit because you need that fast inner loop cycle, you know what I mean? So it's pushing stuff down to your browser and rendering some of the stuff there. So that's one of the gotchas to be aware of. Difference between development mode and production builds. All right, your node modules are not transpiled. So a lot of us are using ES6 and beyond. Not all browsers support that. Your client code will, like the code that you're writing will be transpiled. So if you have ES6 stuff in there, that'll all be transpiled, but your node modules will not be transpiled. So if you're targeting IE11, like we have to, keep that in mind, that any node modules that you're bringing in have to also match up with the target that you're aiming for. And there's some workarounds for that, which we end up deploying, but the easiest solution was for us. I think we only had one node module that was a problem. We just took an older version for that one and pinned that version, and that resolved the issue without us having to jump through a whole bunch of hacky hoops to get that going. Data sources, whenever you update your data source, you have to rebuild the site. Because remember, this is happening at build time. Your data sources are being pulled in at build time. So if you update the data source, let's say, for example, I update a table, then in order for me to see that updated data when I'm doing development or in the build, I have to rerun the build. That could take some time depending on how big your site is. I think they're still working on incremental builds so that you don't have to rebuild the entire site just because one little small piece of data changed. But right now, there's no way of knowing where that piece of data is actually at. So you end up rebuilding the site. There is a cache that's there. So the latter times that you rebuild the site is not as slow as the first time. But that is just something to be aware of, that you may be like, I'm changing the data and you're tweaking your code left and right. And like, why is it not showing up? You gotta rebuild the site. This is just a general thing. I mean, more so React, more so than Gatsby, but remember to use semantic markup. Like, don't put divs all over the place. Like, don't put a div or a span and then do an on-click to make a button. Use a button, you know what I mean? Or a link where it's supposed to be a link. Side rant, because I just was listening to some podcasts recently about semantic markup. So how are we using Gatsby and GraphQL right now? So we did a redesign of the ESC website. We'll link out to it later on. Maybe I'll show you guys before we do the demo. So the architecture is we have a CMS, which is Strappy. It's a node-based CMS that our content writers interact with. We have the website, which is Gatsby generated static files. We take that Gatsby generated static files and we wrap it in an ASP.NET Core application to host it. And that reason for that was because our SA who's going to be deploying and maintaining our site is familiar with Windows and IIS. And we also needed a web API endpoint. So part of our thing is to submit a form. So you need something there listening for the form. We were hoping to do like a Lambda or something like that because there's only 2 API endpoints. But given the short duration of what we had and the resources that we had on staff, it was like, yeah, we'll just do what we're familiar with, and we'll probably swap those out later on for Lambda or AWS when, or Azure Functions, whatever the case may be, once all those things are kind of more settled down. We also have another project, DevOps project, we call it. It's basically used for orchestration. That's the site that goes and pulls the data from Strappy. No, sorry, that's a site that does a couple things. I think I wrote it down here. So that's written in Node. It builds the Strappy. It migrates data from various environments. It builds the site. It deploys to various environments and pushes things up. And the reason for that was that we wanted somewhere that the non-IT people can go and build and push and deploy the site without bothering us. So we have a site, and I'll show you what that looks like a little bit. Demo time. Any questions before we get to a demo? Any questions online? Let me see.
Good.
No? All right, so let's look at a demo. So let's start here. Nope, not there. Start here. Yeah, too many things going on. Let's close that out. All right, so I'll relate to that architecture too as well. For our CMS, we're running Mongo, and that's just in a Docker container, which is just the easiest thing for us to do. So let's say, for example, I wanted to create a new Gatsby site. I can do a Gatsby new entree. Yeah, see, I have a spelling problem. So Gatsby new.
Is there a way you can increase the
font? I don't know if I can do that within here. So I'll get out of here in a second.
Okay.
Andre test. Basically, all I did is type in Gatsby new Andre test, and you'll see it start building my Gatsby site. This takes a few minutes, so I've already, through the magic of post-production, kind of like one of those the cooking shows where they're like, here's all the things, hey, look at that. We pull one out the oven, it's already done.
Pull it out the oven.
So we're gonna stop this one, and we'll go to another environment that's a little bit more
cooking with Andre.
Yeah. And this way we can see a little bit bigger too as well. So here is one that I developed already. So let's make this a little bit bigger so that we can.
Yeah.
There we go. Is that good enough?
Hi, Christine. Yeah.
All right. All right. Cool. So here's what it generated for us. I did one earlier called this one, I think, dev group or something like that. So we have the cache, because I actually built it already, because again, that takes a little while too. So this is the cache folder, and this will change. The public folder is what your output looks like when it's built. Node modules is obviously your node modules folder. The core piece of data is the source. So automatically it creates a components folder for you. It creates a couple of components that are in here. It creates a pages folder for you. And so one of the things that is interesting, because it uses, I believe, I can't remember, I think it's like fetch router. Yeah, it's one of the routers for React. And what it ends up doing is that anytime I put a component in the pages folder, it creates a route for that. So I don't have to go in and configure the route for it. It'll automatically create that route for it. You have an images folder by default as well. And you have a couple other things. We mentioned before this Gatsby config. So there's a couple plugins that are here. We also have our site metadata that gets put in up here as well. So here's where we configure all our plugins, that sort of thing. You see a couple that are already put in here. So plugin sharp is like one of those, remember I talked about that image thing? Mm-hmm. This is part of it where it kind of does some of the image processing for you. Gatsby source file system is that data source that uses your file system to be able to pull things out of your file system. So any images that are in the images folder will now be shown to me in the data source. So I can kind of query them and filter through them and request different things, different attributes on them. Let's see if we can find a few others. So remember that plugin offline thing I told you about? So if you want to enable it, you just uncomment it here. And now you have offline access to your data. All right. I mentioned Gatsby node as well. We don't have anything in this one, so we'll switch over to the other one in a little bit. Gatsby browser is also another place where you can configure some stuff for how your browser API sort of thing work. So if I want to run this site, I would go to my command line. Let's see, I actually have it running. And I can do Gatsby develop, and I put -- port 8001 because I wanted to run on that port. That's not required. It's just that I have something else running on port 8000 already, and I didn't want to have to run through all that. So if we do that, you'll see it kind of get started. There we go. So it's loading the plugins. It runs through some build steps. You'll see the image processing happening in just a second as well. So that quick little thing was the images being processed. And then it creates a development bundle. So it bundles your code as well. So you're not loading all the code at once. You're loading the code that's needed for that individual page. So let's say they drop in on an admin screen, you're not loading all the other stuff before. Like it's split, it's doing the code splitting for you. So if we take a look at what that looks like, this is the out-of-box experience for the starter. This is routing us between one page and the other. So you'll see that the whole page is not really refreshing, although they're two different static sites, two different static pages. So if I dropped in on page 2, I'll get the same experience as if I whatever. So that's the starter, very basic. Let's look at something a little bit more advanced. So this is our ESC website that we did. This is also built in Gatsby. And you notice, you see that really quickly? I'm not sure if you saw it. See how it blurred in? That's that effect, right? Because it's like, yeah, I don't know what size your resolution is and all that stuff. It sends a very blurred image and then it fills it in based on what you need. One of the reasons why we chose Gatsby over Jekyll that the previous developer had chosen is because they had some client-side interactive things that they wanted to do. Later on, we're going to be building games and some other interactive things in there. So it made more sense to have everything be React-based, both on the server and the client, so we don't have this disjoint. Like, how do you send the data that you're putting into the Jekyll side to the client side to do the JavaScript things? You end up putting it into like a JSON file and trying to push it over, and it gets a little weird and muddy. So because of that is one of the reasons why we chose Gatsby, because now we have the same design language on both sides, both the server rendering side, and once we get to the client, it's still the same kind of thing going on there. So you'll also notice as we go from page to page, it's pretty snappy, right? Even within here, it's pretty quick. We have search and all type of stuff built in, and that's all happening via some GraphQL, Gatsby plugins and stuff like that, and interactions that are happening as well. So this search is actually all client side. So let me see if I do. So all that search is happening client side. All the linking back and forth is happening client side, but it's all been generated at build time. Right. Cool. So the form that we have, I think, where's the form? Let's see. And I go to contact us.
Too late.
Yeah. So hit send. All right. So we see that hit this API endpoint. Oh, that's not it. Where is it? Is it too fast? Oh, you know what? It's not showing up here. So it would normally hit an API endpoint here. And basically that API endpoint is in our web API thing as well. So normally what I end up doing is I don't have the API running because we're loading the site.net directly. You can load the API endpoint and then proxy certain requests over to the API endpoint and then proxy the result back. So that way you can simulate what it's going to be in your production environment as well. All right. So let's say, for example, I want to make some changes because currently we had to make some changes for this. So this is all running in our development mode as well currently. Let's see if we, oh wait, I didn't send this over to. Let's allow you guys to all see the code. So this is the code for, nope, that's not the code for that. Let's get rid of that one. This is the code for the ESC website. And I am going to start a live share so that anyone that wants to browse the code can take a look at it. All right. So here, move this guy out the way. All right, so in this channel, there is a live share link, in which case you can see it. Oh yeah, yeah, you can. Yeah, Visual Studio Code can definitely live share, which is pretty awesome. You can share it. Like if you're in Visual Studio Code and someone else is on Visual Studio, you can still live share with them. It's pretty awesome. If you're on a PC and the other person's on a Mac, you can do that as well. It's pretty cool. I use live share a lot with our designers, so they can see it on their screen, but that's running my development environment on their screen. So they can browse different parts of the application. I can make a change and they can see it real time on their end as well. Pretty awesome.
Is that Visual Studio Code or?
Yeah, this is Visual Studio Code. Yeah.
Is there like a plugin you have to install to?
Yeah, it's the live share plugin.
Okay.
I sent the link also in the meeting notice ahead of time. So if you look back at the meeting notice, you'll see there's a link in there.
Got it.
Leighton and I did a demo on this. This is awesome if you're doing pair programming, because multiple people can get in. You can go to different parts of the code. You can edit in different parts of the code if you allow editing. You can share your terminal if you want. You can share your debug session also as well.
You can also like follow somebody too.
Yeah, you can follow someone, so it's great for that. Like this is a session we probably need to redo pretty soon. But the other parts of this too is if I'm running Docker and ASP.NET Core and whatever, and you're on a Mac and you don't have any of those things, it doesn't matter, because you can still get the whole development environment without having any of the dependencies on your end. Really, really cool. I think it's the future of pair programming, but not the topic directly for today. So
yeah, thanks.
Let's do this. I am not sharing a server, so I will also share my server. It's running on port 8000. Yes. So now for those in the live share, if you go to localhost 8000, you should be able to pull up the web API. The website itself. I try to name my terminals here to make it easier. So we have the Strappy terminal is running, so that's running our CMS. And then we have this Gatsby one over here, and that's running our Gatsby environment. I'm going to go back to let me see, close this up because we don't need this at the moment. Get a little bit more screen real estate, and we don't need this at the moment, so we'll get a little bit more screen real estate here. I do want to show you, so the Gatsby is running down here below. You see 148 pages were generated, and it's saying successful at the moment. Our designer wanted to change something on the UI. So inside of, let's say, projects and LCRD, wherever we had, actually, let's do two of them. We'll do this one, and we'll also do technology, where we had captions. She wanted to make this this captions. Anywhere we had images and captions, she wanted to have the caption and the credit be, basically what it looks like here. So we didn't have a captions component before, so we ended up creating a captions component, and we put the styling in, and we did the font sizes up and down and kind of suit her needs. So I'll show you a little bit of how that played out. So let's say we find the captions component, and so there's our captions component. You'll see, I'll point out a couple of things in here. Some of the things that we did, let's say, for example, this is JSX. This is just a regular React component. What we end up doing, and it's maybe a little controversial, is like we have this shared styles thing. Instead of there's a number of ways you can do styles. I like this kind of utility kind of based thing. So for our designer, she had in her XD file, she had sizes in there. So let's say 0.60. And that means something to her. And so what we end up doing is saying, well, we're going to take that language you have, translate that into the class on our end. And that way, everywhere you said this should be 0.60, we'll just put that class. And when you want to adjust that up and down, we just go to one place and we adjust that up and down, and we're fine everywhere else. Same thing for different fonts and capitalizations and italics and bold. Opacity, all those sorts of things we have in this utility class, and then we just pull that in as another dependency into our components, like here, and now we have all those things available to us in our styles. All right. So here's our captions component, and within there we have our text. Basically, it's being displayed here, I believe, here, and we were wrapping that with different classes. Right, so this is 18-point font, open sans, and then we have our span there. And if the credit is there, then we show this other span with the credit. This one is semi-bold, 18-point font in italics. So let's say I want to change this and make this really large for some strange reason. 60. Save it. You see that's running the build really quickly there. If I flip back over, wow. So that's how quickly it can re-render when you're in development mode, that sort of thing. All right. I can do anything to the code itself or the layout within here without changing my data source. Back 18, I can do that. That's that. All right, that's Gatsby. I mentioned GraphQL, so let's take a look at what GraphQL looks like.
Wait, another question.
Yeah.
Steven asked, why is it class name rather than class? Is it working with class properties instead of element attributes?
Yeah, so class name is a React thing. Because class is overloaded, where it could be like a class, as in a JavaScript class, they use class name instead of class. Because all this, although it looks like HTML, is not HTML, it's JavaScript. And then this little portion here gets translated. It gets during the transpile step gets converted to an actual function. This is JSX, which is shorthand for like, I think it came like function not create, blah blah blah, that sort of thing. So because class is already a keyword inside of JavaScript, you can't use class for classes. So they end up using class names. So that's a good question. That's a React thing. Let's look at the, let's look at the GraphQL. So for that page that we're looking at prior, this page here, this is, cool. Let's get rid of that. This whole page is a template that we use for different projects. And so that has different data sources. If you notice, the quick facts here are not going to be the same quick facts on another project, that sort of thing. The data that's also in here is not going to be the same for each project. The quick facts are coming from our CMS, but the data that you see in the tabs here are coming from a JSON file. So we have two different data sources in this one template. So let me show you what that looks like as far as GraphQL looks. Project, so I think it's the right page. Let's make this a little easier to see. Close. Actually, let's just close. Save. What did I change in the footer? I don't know. All right. So here's our projects template page. At the very end of this page, we'll see our GraphQL query. And it doesn't have to be at the end of the page. We just kind of put it there because it's a little easier for us. So this is what a GraphQL query looks like. So think of it almost, it looks like JSON without the data portion of the JSON. So it's like, I want the data result to look like this, filled in with data. All right, so that's what a GraphQL query looks like. There's a few things in here that are not specifically GraphQL, and you can see them a little bit easier when I pull this out. So remember I mentioned that graphical editor? We're going to take a look at that. It's a big query. Lots of different places. Let's go back over to our user. Let's use this one. So I'm running GraphQL already. So this is what GraphQL looks like. And we'll start off with just what do we have here in this UI, right? So we have an Explorer that's not common in every graphical editor. It's something that Gatsby did on top of it, which I think will start to become standard. So I can explore my data without understanding it ahead of time. I can just go in, explore, pull data out, really useful for non-technical people, but good for technical people as well. So that way you can kind of explore the API and see what's possible. This is what my query looks like. So let's say, for example, I want to look at this data source, all Strappy fact. I want to filter based on a sub item in there called project that's equal to LCRD, and I want to pull back these fields. So when I execute that, then on the right you see the data that came back. So you can see the same data structure, but with data now filled into it. Does that make sense? So let me clear that out. And now this part here, let's see. Project, there it is. This is actually, so the one we were looking at before was coming from the CMS. That's where the data source was. For this one in particular, all pages JSON, that is now coming from a JSON file. So if I want to say, give me the tabs, paragraphs, bullet lists, any images that you may have, give me the credit, the caption, and the name. Give me the subheaders, and the page title, the tab title. I hit execute there, and there we go. There's our data source. And again, that's coming from JSON. So the data source for that is, let me show you. That's our data, or our data source, right? So it's just JSON, right? So let me also show you another data source, and that is the file system. So if we look at all file, and I say, give me. There's a lot of things in here. Give me the size, give me the name, give me the extension, and that's good enough for right now. That is now querying my file system. And it's giving me a number of icons, the fab icon, the header, the mission, vision, lower, blah, blah, blah. I can filter that as well. So let's say, for example, I only want things that are in, let's say I want to filter that and say, give me the ones that have an absolute path. Well, actually, you know what? Let's make it easier. Give me the things that have an extension that's equal to JPEG. I run that query now. Apparently I have no JPEGs. Let's do.
I thought I saw one.
I thought so too. Nice. I'm doing something wrong. So now you get to watch me debug this. Well, let's try in instead of. You know what? I think it's, I think I know why. I think it does a dot inside of it. Oh, that's another one. So you saw, right, when I did this, remember I told you about GraphQL has, it's typed. Let's run this first and then we'll come back to that. Oh man, what's going on? All right, let's try, get rid of this. Yeah, so the inside of here is .x.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
But let's say, for example, I ask for something that's not there. See that when I start typing, I get that autocomplete, but I ignore that and I'm still trying to do it. And I get the little curly, squiggly, like, wait a minute, that field does not exist. So you get that type safety within there, right? If I still try to run it anyway, it's going to give me a nice little error saying, wait a minute, no, dude, that doesn't exist. Right, and it'll tell me exactly what the problem is. Right. So that's that. What else did we not cover?
So I had a question.
Yep.
I saw in the query builder, so under the ext field, it presents you with some filter options. Are those dependent on like the type of the?
I don't think so.
Or is it just kind of like you can?
I think it's generic. Yeah, I think it's generic. This is a string. Well, that's a string. Let's find a date and see if it'll make a difference.
See time. Maybe.
See time. Oh yeah, I guess it is different. Yeah. So it is dependent on the type.
Equal,
Yeah.
Greater than, equal.
Yeah.
Cool.
So what it's doing is it's introspecting the API in the type and then determining what the filter things can be based on the type that it is.
Cool.
So you can do, we don't tend to do it on ours. We just do a lot of polling for data, but you can update data. You can subscribe to data as well. So if data changes on the server, then you can subscribe to those changes and get those changes as they happen through GraphQL subscriptions. You can create your own schema and API endpoints as well in GraphQL. And we don't necessarily have time to dive into those, but you can do that as well. What do we not cover? Is there any questions while I try to think of anything that we didn't cover?
Let's see. Steven asks, do simple property names and queries return what's found in those fields, while any properties with constants return constants? Not sure.
All right, constant. So let me try to answer that question. I'm not fully understanding it, but I will try to answer it to the best of my abilities. So any field that has, like, so your data source is going to, whatever's in that particular field at the data source will be returned. If the data source that you're trying to do, let's say, for example, has, trying to find one. Actually, I think this. So this is our one that we copied out earlier. I'm going to take a couple things in here that are not, this thing here is JavaScript. And so we need to take that out.
I said like 960 in the prior query example.
So this guy here, like that. So that one is like saying I want the max size of this thing to be 960. If I were to try to put in a specific field, I'm not sure what would happen. Let's see. I want to try to do a constant in here of like a Andre. I don't think that would work. I won't say no. I just say I don't know how to do it. How you would do a constant that's not coming directly from the data. So like you just want to put something directly into your query and have it always return that. I think that might be what he's asking for. I'm not sure.
Or caption equals Andre for something.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me replace this. It's not working. This is the query that was being used for that page that we looked at before for the project page. A few of these things are like variables that we don't have. So I'm just going to. Page JSON. We'll do that one too. All right. Now. I'm going to execute that. All right, perfect. So here's a couple things I want to show here. So this first here is going to query the file system using a glob pattern. So everything that looks like it has images / projects in that path to give me that data back. And that's that first data source up here is all file. And you'll see that it has this child image sharp. Child image sharp is the image processing thing that we talked about before. So it's processing those images and it's giving back this fluid thing. And fluid based is like a container type, where I can say, I want you to fill the space of whatever this is going to be and give me the best image for that. The other one you can have, I can't remember what it's called, like static or something, like it's always going to be this size, give me this size, that sort of thing. And then I say the original name, give me the original name and the source for that file. I forgot to do that one too as well, so we'll come back to that in a minute. So this other one here is my JSON data source. So it's giving me back all this data here. And the last one is this papers data source, which is coming back from the Strapi API. So you see in one query, I'm getting data from all these different places and getting it all returned to me at one time, which is pretty cool, pretty useful. So you only have the one call going out. A couple of things in here. So you see that this date is this thing is published as a date. So I can format that date in the query. So I want the date in this format, right? Another thing to mention. So in this query, I'm saying I want a max height for this image to be 960. So it's only going to give me back images, like it creates a bunch of smaller images and images of various sizes. Like I want the date in this format, or I mean, the image in this size format. So if I want to say, here's a minimum size I want to be, you put that in the query as well, so that you always get that. You notice here too that this, like, I have in this collateral thing, which is a type, there are subtypes. So collateral is related to projects. File has a public URL. Thumbnails have, collateral has all these things. So I can say I want the collateral data, and related to that, I want the acronym of the project, not all the other fields, but just the acronym. And in file, I only want the public URL, not the other stuff. And these other thumbnail, I want the ID, the public URL, and also this little image thing as well. So I can get the exact shape of the data that I want in my request. It's very powerful. Like I said, I think this is going to be the future for API creation as far as public facing. Some gRPC stuff that's going to be pretty useful internal, but public facing, this I think replaces REST in a lot of ways. There was one last thing I want to show you guys. So let's say, for example, I have files that I don't necessarily want Gatsby to process. I just want to serve them up. So how you would do that is by creating a folder called static at the root of your project. So the static folder here, I have these two PDFs. And basically, I create a folder called static and I create a subfolder called static files. So now if I want to get and serve those static files up, for example, I think we have one in here, static. So inside of here, this is a link. This is using Markdown. So Markdown you can process. I mean, Markdown is also another plugin that you can put into Gatsby. It's like, well, take these Markdown files and treat them as data, so that you can use them over, put them over. So we have Markdown inside of our JSON, and we're processing it that way. So that way we could put in links and other stuff. So this link here is a relative link, and it says static file / LCRD experiment blah 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 experiment PDF. That's going to link over to this file here, and that file will be available in my public folder, which I can show you, which is the output of the build under static files, and there they are. So if you needed to put anything that you just want to drop in, let's say you have some JavaScript that you need to just drop in and be available in the client, or JSON or whatever it needs to be, or CSS or whatever the case may be. You don't want Gatsby to kind of mess with that or do anything with it. Then you can just push it into the static files area, and that's another way. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it. Let's say there are certain. Ooh, I didn't put that in the gotcha. But there are certain files. Let's say the image processing doesn't work with certain file types because you can't really process them like the same way. So what we end up doing is you just import those in. Let's see if I can find one. Trying to think of one area that we did that in. No, not there. Give me a second. Look at the website and see if I can find one that has that. Ooh, the homepage. All right. All right. I think we did kind of remove that. All right. So if I want to have an image that is of one of those types, I can just do an import here, and I can say I want this from component images. Or slash images. Now I have that impact image that I can just use in my code somewhere. Right. So that's another way of pulling in the various resources that you have. All right, cool. Well, this has lasted a lot longer than I thought we could, based on the slides and data. But there's a lot more to it. We just don't really have time to dig into it. I think it's really useful. Again, like I said, the app platform, it's an obvious choice for, in my mind, for static sites. But again, when you load it up, you now have full access to your APIs and full access to your JavaScript engine. Everything you would do in a SPA, you can now do here. So you can have a mixture of like, I want this to be really fast loading for my users, so we'll pre-generate this every so often, but then all the data can be changed at runtime with API endpoint calls and saying, well, here's now the latest data source for that. So great for both static sites as well as applications. Cool.
Great.
Hopefully people learn something, and then hopefully we'll have another session soon. I think you might select you for the Splunk thing.
Sounds good.
Yeah. We have the cloud presentation that's I'm still working on scheduling with Joe and his team. And then there was one other one. Oh, the lightning talks. Now, if we can get the lightning talks, then I'll see if we can get some food for that one. And then we can do lightning talks, 10 minutes or less. Any topic, any dev related, software related topic. Shoot me a message, DM me a message so I can figure out who we have, what we have, so that we can schedule it appropriately. I think that will be pretty useful. And that's it. Thanks everybody for coming. The notes, I'll put the slides in the note in the channel, and I'm going to try to see if we can open source this website, and that way everyone can see it as well. You can use that as another place to see how there's some interesting things that happen in that DevOps project that I mentioned. It's pretty cool. And then also obviously the Gatsby side of things, but then you can see, because the CMS is written in Node, all the configuration changes, all that stuff is all in code. So you can modify it in code there as well. So all that's inside of the same repo. Pretty useful to see. All right, with that, we'll sign off if there's no other questions.
No, looks good.
All right.
Thanks, Andre, and thanks everyone for questions and participation on the Teams chat too.
Awesome. All right.
Thanks. Great meeting.
Yeah. All right, let me see. How do I stop the recording now? Move out of the way. Yeah, I think the recording takes